Guys, it's freezing. The C70 is apparently weatherproof, but we're putting it to the test today, so I'll let you know if it holds up. Let's say your prayers that it does. Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Griffin and I'm a filmmaker based out of Orange County, California. And today I'm here with Delaney and Luna, and we're gonna be testing the Canon C70 versus the 1DX Mark III. Let's get into it. I took both these cameras with me on a recent trip up to Shaver Lake, California with my fiance Delaney. And we were kind of just goofing around a little bit, ran some camera comparisons, as well as just shot some footage for fun. So I'll go ahead and share some of those test results with you guys so you can get a feel for what these cameras are all about. I won't be covering every single thing about these cameras in this video. It's going to be a little bit more covering the things that are specific to these cameras that I haven't covered in some of my other videos. So if you do want to learn more about the C70 or the 1DX Mark III, I've done some pretty extensive testing on my channel, so feel free to check those other videos out. Since we weren't really able to test the dynamic range the way that I wanted to in the mountains, I figured I'd just set up a scene here in my living room and we could kind of show what it might look like if you lit a subject for an interview with a really strong backlight from a window. So here's Delaney set up, and here's a shot with the C70. And here's the 1DX Mark III. So I think they look similar. Now I would say the colors, the C70 I would say is a little bit more true to life, whereas the 1DX Mark III, it comes in slightly cooler and maybe a little more desaturated. And if you actually look at the log image here, you can see on the C70, it actually has a little bit more contrast and saturation in the log image. The C70 is actually, I don't know if it has to do with the dual gain output sensor or what, but it actually has more dynamic range than the 1DX Mark III does in RAW. You can see in the highlights here, the 1DX Mark III, once it hits about 80 IRE, it stops recording any information. Whereas here's the C70 set up for the same scene, it's actually maintaining a lot of that highlight detail. So the C70 allows you to shoot in CLOG 2 in all the frame rates and all the codecs. So that's a huge benefit. Whereas with the 1DX Mark III, it only allows for CLOG 2 when you're recording in 5.5K RAW. Now, the image quality in 5.5K RAW is actually really, really good. The only downside with it is the file sizes are just astronomical. They're really, really big and they're hard to deal with. Actually, a 512 gigabyte CF Express card will only get you about 30 minutes of recording time. Whereas with the C70, you can record in CLOG 2, have basically a really similar image, almost, I mean, I would say it's actually a little bit better, and the files are going to be so much smaller and easier to deal with. And on top of that, they're actually easier to edit on your computer as well compared to the 5.5K RAW from the 1DX Mark III. When it comes to the non-RAW format in the 1DX Mark III, the only log option that's available at the time of recording this video is CLOG 1. Now you can see from this test here, here's the CLOG 1 from the 1DX Mark III. And we'll compare that to the C70. You can tell there's quite a bit more dynamic range. And in my opinion, the skin tones look much more natural in the C70. The 1DX Mark III in its CLOG 1 version, at least when I use the Canon LUTS, it has sort of a orange color to it that I'm just not really a fan of. Now that's not to say that the CLOG 1 has bad dynamic range or something like that. I would say it's pretty much on par with a lot of the other mirrorless cameras or DSLRs out there. It's just not necessarily like industry leading or the best in class. I would say if you really want to get the most out of the 1DX Mark III, you're going to have to shoot in the RAW mode and deal with the large file sizes. That's kind of one of the trade-offs of using the camera. In terms of autofocus, I think both these cameras have different strengths and different weaknesses. I would say overall, if I had to pick one, I greatly prefer the 1DX Mark III's autofocus over the C70. It's much easier to use, it's more intuitive, you can literally just tap the screen and track, and it's incredibly consistent. It's consistent in low light, it's consistent with darker skin tones, it's consistent basically all the time. The one and only thing that I don't like about it is it doesn't have the face-only mode. That's exclusive to the Canon Cinema line. So with the C70, it's got this really nice face-only mode. So you can see in this scene here in the mountains, Delaney's walking towards us, keeps her in focus perfectly, and then when she leaves the frame, it doesn't jump to the background. Now here's the same exact situation with the 1DX Mark III. It actually grabs her further in the frame, so when her face is smaller in the frame and it's a harder subject to track, it still has a much easier time. It tracks her perfectly the whole way. And once she leaves the frame, the camera's looking for something to focus on, so it jumps to the background there, which to me, it's kind of an amateur look. It's not necessarily something that you would ever do intentionally. So if you're gonna rack focus and you're manually doing it, you would probably follow your subject, but you wouldn't throw it to the background right when they leave the frame. So that's not the best look. Now there's ways around it. You can keep your thumb on the manual focus switch on the lens and just flick it off as soon as they leave the frame, but it's not as smooth or as good as the C70's version. I find that really cool if you're recording something like an interview, and actually I'm recording on the 1DX Mark III right now because my other cameras are rented out. So here's a perfect example. When I leave the frame, the camera, I'm assuming it jumped to the background because that's usually what it does if somebody leaves the frame. Whereas with the C70, C500, C200, the Cinema line, if you did that exact same situation, the focus wouldn't jump to the background and then have to reacquire me when I come in the frame. If I were using either of these cameras on a gimbal, I would greatly prefer the 1DX Mark III because it has the tap to track focus where you literally just tap the subject, grabs on, it's super confident, and it really won't lose your subject. Whereas with the C70, you kind of need to have the subject's face kind of prominently in frame. So like a circumstance like this, the C70 would do great. But if it's low light, if you have darker skin tones, it's gonna struggle. I've seen some situations where it really had a hard time. In terms of usability, I would say both these cameras are pretty good. The C70 is a little bit more complex. There's kind of a lot going on in the menus, but once you get acclimated to them, it's pretty simple. And you can also have way more control because it gives you features like waveform, zebras, as well as built-in ND filters and shutter angle, instead of having to adjust your shutter speed every time you change your frames per second. So the C70 is really set up for video first. It's also got a really nice flip screen that I find myself using quite a bit. It's not like incredible, and it's not necessarily big enough for a lot of professional work if you're manually pulling focus, but if you're just using autofocus, it's definitely good enough to frame up your shot. I would say with the 1DX Mark III, one of the biggest things that prevents me from using it a lot for video is the fact that it doesn't have a flip screen. That makes it really tough for me, especially because I'm so tall. I find myself literally like bent over like a giraffe at the watering hole trying to see the screen if I want to film anything from a lower angle. If I'm filming like from up here, that's okay, but usually I'm not. So I don't find myself using it quite as much. Also because you can't monitor CLOG 2, I find that challenging, and the fact that there's no waveform built into the camera makes it really tough as well. So Canon says both these cameras are weather sealed. I would say the 1DX Mark III is substantially better than the C70. When I was out in that storm, I had total confidence that the 1DX Mark III was gonna be completely fine. The C70, I'm gonna be honest, I was getting pretty nervous, but it did survive and it was totally fine as well. I just wouldn't wanna do that on a repeated basis, and I wouldn't wanna test my luck. In terms of photography, the C70 can't take pictures. I think it does have a feature where you can do like a frame grab or something like that, but it's like useless. Like you may as well take it on your iPhone. That doesn't even count. It's a JPEG only, and it can never be used for anything professional, in my opinion. With the 1DX Mark III, you're basically shooting on what I would consider still to this day, my favorite professional photography camera that exists. There's some good options from Sony, and from the R5's cool too, but if you had to ask me which camera I take on 100% of my professional photo jobs, it's the 1DX Mark III. The camera's ergonomics are amazing. I really like the way it feels when you're taking photos. Love the sound of the shutter, like I mentioned many times before. It can shoot 20 frames a second mechanical and electronic, and the electronic is completely silent, which is really cool too. So I would say overall, it's an incredible photo camera, and it has really good dynamic range for stills as well. In terms of high ISO performance, I didn't test these cameras side by side, but I already have a really good feel for what these cameras are capable of because I've done some pretty extensive testing in my other videos. I would say with the C70, I'm comfortable using it up to about 6400 ISO, and with the 1DX Mark III, I feel totally confident using it at 12,800, and sometimes honestly even 25,600 if I really had to. Now I would say 12,800 is kind of the limit where I feel comfortable. Even once you start climbing up the high ISOs, like 25,600, it's still decently usable. It's one of the best high ISO performers that I've ever used. If you're trying to decide between these two cameras, my personal recommendation would be, if you can, rent them. Rent both of them, shoot with them, see which one you like the best. Now, if that's not an option, I imagine that's that's probably something that's tough to do for a lot of the people out there because maybe you can't afford to rent them for the day or something like that, or you don't have access to them. Then my recommendation would be, if you're solely a video shooter, you'll probably be a little bit better off with the C70, just because it really has all those professional features built in. It's got XLR audio, it's got ND filters built in, it's got a really nice middle ground codec with a ton of dynamic range. It's got a nice small form factor, and you can build it up a little bit if you wanted to. And I would say with the 1DX Mark III, if you're someone who's a hybrid shooter, meaning you shoot both photos and videos, I would say that's gonna be the best camera for you. Needless to say, the C70 doesn't take pictures, so the 1DX Mark III's got it there. And I would say also in a really fast-paced run and gun environment, both can do well. If you really need to have great autofocus and you don't mind using like a variable ND filter, then the 1DX Mark III might be great for you. If you need to do a lot of action, for example, as well, then I would say the autofocus in the 1DX Mark III is a lot better for tracking. And if you find yourself doing more circumstances like corporate interviews, documentaries, long form content, maybe you're doing even some commercials, then I'd say the C70 is probably gonna be better for you. With that in mind, I do have a commercial coming up that I'm gonna be using the C70 on alongside my C500 Mark II. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button and checking that out. That should be coming next week. So anyways, guys, I know this video is a little all over the place, wasn't exactly like my normal videos, but hopefully you enjoyed it anyway, and hopefully you got something valuable out of it. If you like this kind of video, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.